The snow had stopped falling an hour before dawn, leaving the Ardennes forest wrapped in a silence so complete that Private First Class Isaiah Washington could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He crouched behind a fallen oak, its bark slick with ice, and watched his breath materialize in pale clouds that hung in the frozen air before dissolving into nothing. His fingers ached inside his wool gloves, and he flexed them carefully around the stock of his M1 Garand, trying to keep the blood flowing without making noise. It was December 20th, 1944, and the German counteroffensive that would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge was 5 days old. The Wehrmacht had torn through American lines with a ferocity that had stunned commanders from the front all the way back to Paris. Towns that had been secure just days ago were now behind enemy lines. Supply routes had been cut. Entire units had been surrounded and destroyed. And here in the forest east of Bastogne, the situation remained chaos, fluid, desperate, and deadly. Washington was 23 years old, born and raised in South Philadelphia, where his father worked the docks and his mother cleaned houses in Rittenhouse Square. He'd been drafted in 1943, sent to Camp Hood in Texas for training, and assigned to a segregated supply battalion that was supposed to stay well behind the lines. But when the Germans punched through at the Bulge, every man who could hold a rifle had been thrown into the fight. Washington and dozens of other black soldiers from service units had been hastily armed and attached to whatever frontline companies needed bodies. No time for integration debates now. No time for the careful calculations of who should fight beside whom. Just survival. Beside him, crouched low against the same fallen tree, was Corporal Marcus Hayes. Hayes was older, 31, and had worked as a mechanic in Detroit before the war. He'd actually volunteered in 1942, believing the recruiting posters that promised equal treatment in the fight against fascism. That optimism had been beaten out of him during training, where white officers had made it clear that black soldiers were considered less capable, less trustworthy, less American. But Hayes had a stubborn streak that kept him going. He was stocky and strong, with a square jaw that stayed set even when his eyes showed doubt. Right now those eyes were scanning the tree line ahead, looking for movement, looking for the cabin their lieutenant had sent them to find. The third man was Private Eugene Chambers, 20 years old, from rural North Carolina. Chambers had grown up poor even by Depression standards, picking tobacco and cotton for white landowners who paid in scrip and threats. The Army had been an escape from that life, though he'd quickly learned that Jim Crow had followed him into uniform. He was lanky and quick, with hands that never seemed to stop moving, adjusting his helmet, checking his rifle, touching the rosary his grandmother had pressed into his palm the day he left home. Chambers was scared most of the time, but he'd learned to function through the fear, to let it sharpen his senses rather than paralyze him. They'd been sent out 3 hours ago, just after midnight, with simple orders: patrol east along the ridge, investigate reports of German artillery observers operating in the sector, and report back before dawn. Don't engage unless necessary. Don't get cut off. Don't die. The forest around them was a cathedral of bare trees and shadows. Snow covered everything in uneven drifts, some knee-deep, others blown clear by wind to reveal frozen earth beneath. The terrain rolled and dropped unpredictably, cut by small ravines and studded with rock outcroppings that jutted from the ground like broken teeth. In daylight, this country would have been hard enough to navigate. In darkness, with German patrols prowling and artillery falling at random intervals, it felt like moving through a nightmare. Washington shifted his weight, and his boot broke through the crust of ice on the snow with a sound like cracking glass. All three men froze. Hayes shot him a look, half warning, half sympathy. They waited, listening, but the forest remained still. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, Hayes made a hand signal. Move forward, slow and quiet. They rose and advanced in a loose file, Hayes in the lead, Washington in the middle, Chambers watching their rear. Each step was a calculation: where to place your foot, how much weight to commit, whether to step over or around that branch. Their wool uniforms were soaked through from crawling through snow and brush. The fabric froze stiff in places, chafing against their skin. Washington's feet had gone numb hours ago, and he knew better than to think about whether he was getting frostbite. You kept moving or you died. Those were the only options the Ardennes offered. They'd been walking for 20 minutes when Hayes raised a fist, the signal to halt. Washington dropped immediately to one knee, bringing his rifle up, scanning the darkness. Chambers pressed himself against the nearest tree. For a long moment there was nothing. Just wind moving through the upper branches and the distant crump of artillery somewhere to the south. Then Washington saw it, a faint glow, flickering in orange, visible through the trees about 200 yards ahead. A light source, fire or lantern, which meant shelter, which meant people. Hayes crawled backward to where Washington crouched and leaned in close. speaking directly into his ear in a whisper barely louder than breathing. "Cabin. See it?" Washington nodded. "Could be ours. Not on the map." Lieutenant said nothing friendly this far east. Hayes paused, thinking. Germans use forward observer teams, 2 or 3 men, set up in high ground direct artillery by radio. Washington understood. If there were German artillery spotters in that cabin, they'd be calling in fire missions on American positions, adjusting strikes, directing the 88s and 105s that had been tearing apart tank columns and infantry formations for the past 5 days. Taking out an observer team could save dozens of lives, maybe hundreds. "What do we do?" Chambers had crept forward to join them, his voice tight with tension. Hayes looked at both of them, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Orders say don't engage, report and withdraw. How long to get back to the line?" Washington asked. 2 hours at least. Maybe 3 in this snow, which meant that by the time they reported the cabin's location and a larger force could be organized, the Germans might have moved on. Observer teams were mobile by necessity, setting up for a few hours, calling in fire, then displacing before counter-battery fire could find them. This might be the only chance. Washington could see Hayes working through the same calculation. They were 3 men, lightly armed, operating in darkness in enemy territory with no support. By every measure of military sense, they should withdraw and report. But Washington had seen what German artillery could do. He'd helped pull bodies from a farmhouse that had taken a direct hit 2 days ago, bodies so mangled they couldn't be identified except by checking. Dog tags still hanging from pieces of neck. If they walked away now, how many more farmhouses would be hit tomorrow? "We take a look," Hayes finally said. "Get close. Assess the situation. If it's more than we can handle, we pull back and report." "Agreed?" Washington and Chambers both nodded. It wasn't really a decision. It was an acknowledgement of what they all already knew they were going to do. They moved forward with even greater care now, taking 5 minutes to cover 50 yards. The cabin gradually came into focus through the trees. A small structure, probably a woodcutter shelter or hunting lodge, with stone walls and a sloped roof. The light they'd seen came from a single window, poorly blacked out, with firelight leaking around the edges of what looked like a blanket or tarp hung inside. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney. No vehicles visible, no guards posted outside that they could see. But that didn't mean much. The Germans were as cold and tired as everyone else. They'd pull security inside if they could. Hayes found a position behind a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the cabin and pulled out the patrol's only pair of binoculars. He studied the building for a full minute, sweeping from left to right, checking angles and approaches. Washington and Chambers waited, rifles ready, eyes scanning their flanks for any sign they'd been spotted. "One door, front," Hayes whispered when he lowered the binoculars. "Windows on front and side. Can't see the back from here. Chimney smoking, so they've been there a while. How many inside?" Chambers asked. "Can't tell, but observer teams usually run 2 to 3 men, radio operator, officer to direct fire. Maybe a security element, so we're either evenly matched or outnumbered," Washington said. Hayes gave him a thin smile. "It's about the size of it." They discussed it in whispers, working out a plan. There was no way to surround the cabin with 3 men, but they could cover the front and one side. Hayes would approach from the left, using the tree line for cover, and take a position where he could see both the door and the side window. Washington would work around to the right and cover the front from a different angle. Chambers, the best shot among them, would stay back in overwatch with clear lines of fire to the door and front window. If shooting started, his job was to keep anyone from getting out. They synchronized watch, a habit from training that felt absurdly formal given the circumstances. Hayes would begin his approach in 2 minutes. Washington 30 seconds after that. If anyone was discovered, the plan collapsed and they'd have to improvise. Washington waited, counting seconds in his head, watching his breath frost in the air. His hands trembled slightly, and not from cold. He'd been in firefights before, brief, chaotic exchanges of bullets in forests and fields, but this was different. This was deliberate, planned. He was choosing to walk toward danger rather than stumbling into it. He thought about his mother, who'd cried when he left Philadelphia but told him to stand tall and come home safe. He thought about his father, who'd served in the First World War and never talked about it except to say that black men had fought and bled and died for a country that didn't love them back, but they'd done it anyway because it was still their country too, for better or worse. Washington had never fully understood that until now, the bitter complexity of fighting for a place that treated you like a second-class citizen, but still believing the fight mattered. The seconds ticked past. He saw Hayes rise and begin moving, a shadow among shadows, picking his way through the snow with practiced care. Washington took a breath, said a quick prayer, and started his own approach. Moving alone was worse than moving with the others. Every sound seemed magnified, as every exposed stretch of ground felt like walking across a spotlight. He kept low, using trees and rocks for concealment, freezing whenever branches rustled or snow shifted. The cabin grew larger, the light from the window more distinct. He could smell wood smoke now, and under it something else: tobacco and boiled coffee and unwashed bodies. Human smells. The enemy was just men, cold and tired like him. He reached a fallen log about 30 yards from the cabin's right side and settled behind it, checking his rifle and pulling 2 grenades from his belt to have them ready. From this position he could see the front door clearly and part of the window. The blanket hung across it shifted slightly, someone moving inside. Hayes was in position on the opposite side. Washington couldn't see him, but he knew he was there. Chambers had remained farther back, prone in the snow behind good cover. They waited. For 3 long minutes nothing happened. The cabin sat silent except for the whisper of smoke from the chimney. Washington's legs cramped from holding still in the cold. His breath came in shallow, measured rhythms that he tried to keep quiet. Sweat gathered under his helmet despite the freezing temperature. Then voices, German voices, muffled by the stone walls but audible in the frozen stillness. 2 men, maybe 3, speaking in conversational tones. One laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly cut off. Someone else said something sharp, the tone clearly a rebuke. Then silence again. Washington looked toward where Hayes should be and caught a glimpse of movement. Hayes was advancing on the cabin, moving from his covered position toward the door. This wasn't part of the plan. They were supposed to observe and assess, not assault. But Hayes must have seen or heard something that changed his calculation. Washington made a decision. If Hayes was moving, he'd provide cover. He rose to a crouch and advanced as well, angling to put himself where he could see the door straight on. His heart hammered. The distance closed. 20 yards, 15, 10. Hayes reached the wall beside the door and pressed himself flat against the stone. He looked back, found Washington, and made hand signals. 2 inside. Radio equipment visible. Door opens inward. On my signal. Washington positioned himself in front of the window, rifle aimed at the blanket. If anyone looked out, they'd see him, but there was no help for that now. They were committed. Hayes reached the door and tested the handle slowly. It turned. Not locked, why would it be in what they thought was friendly territory? He looked back one more time, made eye contact with Washington, and held up 3 fingers. Then 2, then 1. Hayes threw the door open and rushed inside, rifle up, shouting, "Hand ho! Hand ho!" Hands up, one of the few German phrases they'd all learned. Washington was right behind him, sweeping right as Hayes went left, trying to take in the whole room in a fraction of a second. The cabin was small, maybe 15 feet square, with a fireplace along one wall and a rough wooden table in the center. 2 German soldiers sat at the table, and a third piece of equipment. A radio set occupied one corner with maps spread beside it. The Germans were in the process of standing, one reaching for a rifle leaning against the wall, the other frozen with a tin cup halfway to his mouth. "Hand ho!" Hayes shouted again, advancing with his rifle trained on the man reaching for the weapon. Everything happened in compressed time. The German going for the rifle completed his motion, grabbing it and starting to swing it toward Hayes. Washington fired without thinking. The M1's cracked deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet hit the German in the shoulder and spun him around, the rifle clattering to the floor. The second German dropped his cup and lunged for something on the table, a pistol. Hayes fired, the round catching the man in the chest and slamming him backward into the wall. Then silence, ringing and absolute except for the wet, labored breathing of the wounded German on the floor and the rattle of displaced equipment. Washington's hands shook violently. He'd never shot a man at close range before. He could see the impact site on the German's shoulder, blood spreading dark across the Feldgrau uniform. The man was young, maybe younger than Washington, with a thin face and wide, shocked eyes. Hayes moved quickly, kicking the rifle away from the wounded German and checking the second man, who'd slumped against the wall and wasn't moving. "Dead," Hayes said flatly. He looked at Washington. "You all right?" Washington nodded, not trusting his voice. The door still hung open and Chambers appeared in it, breathing hard, rifle at the ready. "Anyone else?" "Just these 2, Hayes said. He gestured to the wounded German. "Chambers, secure him." "Washington, check that radio equipment." They moved mechanically, training overriding shock. Chambers produced rope from his pack and bound the wounded German's hands and feet, working around the injured shoulder as gently as the situation allowed. The German hissed in pain but didn't resist. His eyes darted between them, and Washington could see him processing what he was seeing. Black American soldiers. The German propaganda had claimed the Americans used inferior troops of mongrel races. Now here was confirmation, though not in the way the propaganda had meant. Washington turned to the equipment in the corner. The radio was a standard German field set, still powered on with a microphone hanging from a hook. Beside it lay topographical maps of the sector, marked with pencil notations, coordinates, timing notes, target designations. This was exactly what they'd hoped to find, an active forward observer post with current intelligence. "Hayes, look at this," Washington said, pulling the maps toward him. Hayes came over, leaving Chambers to finish securing the prisoner. He studied the maps, tracing the markings with his finger, grid coordinates. "These are American positions, or where the Germans think our positions are." He pointed to a series of notations. "Fire missions. They've been directing strikes all day." Washington felt cold rage building. These two men sitting in this cabin drinking coffee had been calling down artillery on American troops with the same casual efficiency as clerks processing paperwork. The dead soldier by the wall had probably killed dozens of men without ever seeing their faces. A groan from the wounded German pulled his attention. Chambers had finished binding him and was now trying to pack the shoulder wound with a compress from his medical kit. "He's losing blood," Chambers said. "Needs proper treatment sooner, he'll bleed out." Hayes looked at the German, his expression hard. Washington knew what he was thinking, the same thing they were all thinking. This man had been directing artillery fire on Americans. How many had died because of the coordinates he'd called in? Did he deserve medical attention? Did he deserve to live? But Hayes was a corporal, and he'd been trained in the laws of war, even if those laws felt abstract in the reality of combat. "Do what you can for him," he said. "He's a prisoner now." The German spoke, his English heavily accented but understandable. Please. I am only soldier." "Following orders." "Yeah," Washington said, his voice harder than he intended. "So are we." Hayes was gathering the maps and documents, stuffing them into his pack. "We need to move. That gunfire will have been heard. If there are other German units in the area, they'll come to investigate." "What about the radio?" Washington asked. "Destroy it. We take the documents and the prisoner." Chambers looked up from the wounded German. "He can't walk far. Not with this wound." Hayes swore under his breath. It was a tactical problem with no good solution. They couldn't leave the German here. He'd either bleed out or be recovered by his own side and could report what had happened. They couldn't carry him, not through snow and forest with miles to cover, and they couldn't stay. "We'll move him as far as he can go," Hayes decided. "If he can't keep up ... single quotes." He left the sentence unfinished, but they all understood. War created impossible choices, and sometimes mercy had to be measured against survival. Washington smashed the radio with the butt of his rifle, taking grim satisfaction in the crunch of vacuum tubes and the sparking of severed connections. He kicked the wreckage into the fire along with any maps and papers they couldn't carry. Within minutes, the documents were curling and blackening. They hauled the German to his feet. He was taller than any of them, but injury and blood loss had weakened him. He swayed, and Washington caught him feeling the unnatural heat of fever already beginning in the man's body. Infection setting in fast. Without proper medical care, he'd be dead in a day, maybe two. "What's your name?" Washington asked. The German looked at him, surprised by the question. "Klaus," he said. "Klaus Hoffman. All right, Klaus. You're going to walk. We'll help you, but you need to move. Understand?" Hoffman nodded. "I understand." They left the cabin, Hayes in the lead, Hoffman supported between Washington and Chambers, moving back the way they'd come. The journey out was a nightmare. Hoffman could barely stay conscious, let alone maintain the pace they needed. Every 100 yards they had to stop and let him rest. Blood seeped through the compress on his shoulder, leaving a trail in the snow that Washington knew could be followed. Dawn was beginning to break, the darkness shifting to a gray half-light that made the forest look like a photograph slowly developing. This was the most dangerous time. Enough light to be seen, not enough to see clearly. And they were still deep in contested territory. They'd covered perhaps half a mile when they heard it, voices behind them shouting in German. A patrol following their tracks. Hayes heard it too and stopped, lowering Hoffman to the ground behind a fallen tree. "How many?" Chambers whispered. Hayes held up his hand and listened. More shouting, closer now. Maybe 5 or 6 voices. Too many to fight. "We need to move," Washington said. Hayes looked at Hoffman, who was semi-conscious, eyes rolling. Then he looked at Washington and Chambers. The calculation was clear. They couldn't move fast enough with the wounded German. If they tried to bring him, the patrol would catch them all. If they left him, they might escape. "Leave him," Hayes said. "We take the documents and go." Chambers looked stricken. We can and we will," Hayes cut him off. "Those documents are worth more than one wounded German. They could save American lives. That's what matters." Washington felt something twist inside him. Hayes was right by any military logic. The intelligence they carried was valuable, but leaving a wounded man, even an enemy, felt like crossing a line. Hoffman's eyes cleared for a moment. He understood what was being discussed, even if he couldn't follow all the words. "Please," he said. "Don't leave me." The voices behind them were getting closer. They had maybe 2 minutes. Washington made a decision. "I'll stay with him," he said. "You two take the documents back." Hayes turned on him. "Don't be stupid. We all go or we all stay." "Then we all get captured or killed," Washington shot back. "This way the documents get through. Someone stays with the prisoner until the patrol picks him up." "It's the right call." "Like hell it is," Chambers said. "We're not leaving you." The voices were very close now, branches breaking. The patrol was moving fast, following their trail. Hayes grabbed Washington's arm. "You stay here, they'll take you prisoner. Best case. Worst case, they shoot you on the spot for killing their guys." "Then I better talk fast when they show up," Washington said. He pulled his arm free and checked his rifle, making sure the safety was on. "Go. That's an order." "You don't outrank me," Hayes said. "No, but I'm right." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Hayes swore viciously and grabbed Chambers. "Move. Now." Chambers hesitated, looking back at Washington with an expression of anguish and fury. "Isaiah, go," Washington said again. They went, moving fast and low through the trees. Washington watched them disappear into the gray dawn light, then turned back to Hoffman, who was staring at him with confusion and something that might have been gratitude. "Why?" Hoffman asked. Washington sat down beside him, rifled across his knees. "Damned if I know," he said honestly. The German patrol emerged from the trees less than a minute later. 6 Wehrmacht soldiers, weapons ready, scanning for targets. They spotted Washington immediately and shouted, "Rifles coming up." Washington very carefully raised his hands, keeping them high and visible. "Nicht schießen," he called out, hoping he was pronouncing it correctly. "Don't shoot, Gefangener, prisoner." The Germans approached cautiously. Their sergeant, an older man with a scarred face, kept his rifle trained on Washington while the others checked Hoffman. Rapid conversation in German, too fast for Washington to follow. Hoffman said something, pointing at his shoulder, then toward Washington. The sergeant's expression changed, some of the hostility fading into something more complex. They took Washington's rifle and searched him roughly, checking for hidden weapons. Then they lifted Hoffman and 2 soldiers supported him while the others formed a loose perimeter. The sergeant gestured for Washington to walk ahead of them, back toward the German lines. As they moved through the forest, Washington thought about Hayes and Chambers, hopefully making it back with the documents. He thought about the coordinates and firing schedules that would now never be used, the American soldiers who would live because an artillery strike wouldn't land on their position. He thought about his father's words, black men fighting for a country that didn't love them back. Maybe it wasn't about love. Maybe it was about choosing again and again to do the right thing, even when the right thing was complicated and painful and likely to get you killed. Maybe that was what being a soldier meant, any soldier, any color, any nation. The German sergeant said something to him, the tone almost conversational despite the language barrier. Washington shook his head, no understand. The sergeant tried again in broken English. "You stay with him. With Klaus." "Why?" Washington looked back at Hoffman being carried by his comrades and then at the sergeant. "Because," he said slowly, "that's what soldiers do." The sergeant studied him for a moment, then nodded once, a gesture that might have been respect. They walked on through the Ardennes forest as the sun rose higher, burning off the mist, revealing the ancient trees and the snow-covered earth and the endless evidence of war. Shell craters, shattered timber, frozen earth torn by metal and fire. Washington didn't know what would happen to him. Prisoner of war camp, most likely, if he was lucky. Months or years behind barbed wire, waiting for the war to end. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd crouched behind that fallen oak in the darkness, planning the assault on the cabin. But it was an ending he could live with if he lived at all. Behind him, miles away by now, Hayes and Chambers were carrying documents that would disrupt German artillery operations, save American lives, and contribute in some small way to winning the war. The 3 black soldiers from a segregated service battalion, who weren't supposed to be fighting on the front lines at all, had completed their mission. In the frozen December morning, in a forest in Belgium where empires were colliding and history was being written in blood and courage, that would have to be enough.